So we have a major development in one of the most important election law battles that's going on in the country, because this case is now back in front of the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. And recently, the Trump administration, the Trump DOJ, has officially stepped in and they're supporting Alabama's current position. And now Republican members of Congress are also jumping into this fight. The National Republican Congressional Committee has filed a new amicus brief supporting Alabama, and they're urging the Supreme Court to intervene on an emergency basis. And this is all happening while later today, the challengers must file their response and argue why Alabama and their congressional map should still be struck down. So let's break down what is happening in this current case, which is going to impact the upcoming election, and it's pending in front of the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to expand upon their benefits to give you as much as possible as a member. And right now, for a limited time for the anniversary of the United States, you can use my code ARMSCHOLAR using the links down below as well. You can sign up and get $50 off of your individual sign-up fee, or $25 off of your family fee. Now, if you've been following this case, you know that the Supreme Court recently issued a major 6-3 ruling in a case called Louisiana versus Calais. That decision significantly changed how federal courts are supposed to analyze Voting Rights Act Section 2 vote dilution claims. Among other things, the Supreme Court emphasized that lower courts must separate race from politics and must account for a state's legitimate political goals and traditional districting principles when evaluating congressional maps. Following that decision, Alabama immediately asked the Supreme Court to revisit some prior rulings by the lower court, which blocked the state's 2023 congressional map. And the Supreme Court did agree to review that case, and the Supreme Court vacated the prior injunctions and sent the case back down to the lower court for reconsideration under the new Calais framework. That was a huge development because Alabama viewed the Supreme Court's action as confirmation that the lower court needed to take a fresh look at the case under these new standards, and also that their prior ruling was then vacated. But when the case went back down to the 3-judge panel in the lower court, the judges once again ruled against Alabama. The lower court issued a new preliminary injunction blocking Alabama from using its 2023 congressional map and ordered the state to continue using the court-ordered special master map that was used during the 2024 election cycle and recently during the 2026 primaries. The judges concluded that even after reconsidering the case in light of that 6-3 ruling in Calais, they still believe that Alabama's map likely involved intentional racial discrimination and unlawful vote dilution, and that immediately set up another showdown at the Supreme Court level. Alabama has now officially returned to the Supreme Court just weeks after that new ruling, and they asked for emergency relief in this case. Specifically, Alabama wants the Supreme Court to immediately block the lower court's injunction and allow the state to use its 2023 congressional map during this upcoming election cycle. The state argues that the lower court effectively ignored the Supreme Court's prior instructions and simply reissued the same ruling that the Supreme Court had already vacated and remanded. According to Alabama, the district court is still improperly requiring the state to create a second majority black congressional district, even though that decision by the Supreme Court specifically instructed the courts to account for legitimate political goals and race-neutral districting principles. The state of Alabama argues that its 2023 map was based on traditional districting principles and political objectives, including reunifying regions as much as possible, avoiding incumbent pairings in certain districts, and preserving Republican voting strength in a heavily Republican state of Alabama. So they took this case back to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis after that new lower court ruling, and now this case is also getting support at the Supreme Court level on an emergency basis from the Trump DOJ. The Trump DOJ has officially filed a brief supporting Alabama, and they're asking the Supreme Court to intervene in this case. The federal government argues that the lower court completely failed to follow the Supreme Court's new framework in Calais. The DOJ says that the district court failed to disentangle race from partisan politics, ignored Alabama's political goals, and improperly treated Alabama's refusal to create a second black majority district as evidence of racial discrimination. The federal government also argues that the district court violated the Supreme Court's Purcell Doctrine by changing election rules and congressional maps deep into this election cycle. So not only did Alabama just get support from the Trump DOJ, now there is another development where more players are jumping into this fight and supporting Alabama's position. The National Republican Congressional Committee, the organization responsible for helping to elect Republicans into the U.S. House, they have officially filed an amicus brief as well supporting Alabama, and they're asking the Supreme Court to grant them emergency relief. The NRCC argues that this case has consequences far beyond Alabama because congressional district lines directly impact candidates, campaigns, political parties, and voters during an active election cycle. The organization argues that federal courts are not supposed to function as redistricting commissions and that the Constitution gives primary responsibility for drawing these congressional districts to state legislators, not federal judges. The brief also argues that after the Supreme Court vacated the prior injunction, Alabama's 2023 map became the operative map once again in the state, and that the district court improperly stepped back in and reinstated its preferred court-drawn map in the middle of this election cycle. According to the NRCC, allowing the lower court's order to remain in place risks disrupting campaigns, confusing voters, and upsetting what they describe as the constitutional balance between state legislators and federal courts. So now this is no longer just Alabama versus the challengers here. The Trump DOJ is supporting Alabama, and now also you have congressional Republicans through the committee asking the Supreme Court to step in as well on an emergency basis. Now, as you may recall, recently Justice Thomas, who handles emergency applications that arise out of the 11th Circuit, he already acted on Alabama's emergency application and ordered that the challengers needed to file a response by 4 p.m. today. So later today, the Supreme Court will finally have the emergency arguments from both sides, so the challengers will finally file their response. And once the response is filed, the Supreme Court could act very quickly. The court could deny relief. The court here could issue an administrative stay, which was requested. The court could grant a stay pending appeal, or the court could just issue a broader ruling addressing how the Calais decision should have been applied moving forward in this case. But the key takeaway is that this fight is actively before the Supreme Court right now. And more interesting, there's more parties jumping in trying to support Alabama, and no doubt there's going to be other parties jumping in to support the challengers trying to oppose that Alabama 2023 congressional map. The Supreme Court's new Calais decision already reshaped this area of law, and now the justices have to decide whether the lower courts are actually following that ruling. And the answer could affect redistricting litigation across the country for years to come. It could affect, the balance of power in Congress as well, because Alabama's competing maps could lead to very different political outcomes based on which one is used. So that's the latest major update in the Alabama election/redistricting battle that's in the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. Right now, the court here is waiting for those responses from the challengers. They're going to review the amicus brief. They're going to review all these briefs. Also, like I said, no doubt that there's going to be amicus briefs filed opposing Alabama's position, and then they're going to consider that, and they could act on this very fast. So this case is moving incredibly fast, and there is a very real possibility that we could see action from the Supreme Court within days of this. So as soon as that happens, as this develops and we get more information, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.